All right. Well, I think we're good to start. So I'd like to say to everyone a warm welcome to a new episode of the China Institute's China This Century conversation series. This is a series where we seek to examine key factors driving China's current and future trajectory and consider the nature of its interactions with Canada and the world. This is all with the objective of helping to deepen understanding of contemporary China, as well as encouraging enlightened engagement with China going forward. Before I proceed a bit any further, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement, which goes as follows. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. My name is Philip Rowe. I'm the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. And I'm absolutely delighted to have Anton Malkin, assistant professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, joining us today. I had the pleasure of getting to know Anton over the course of the last few years in China when he was teaching in Shenzhen, and when I was consul general in Guangzhou, just up the road a little bit. And I've always been impressed by his analytical acumen as well as his deep understanding of many aspects of what drives China's political economy today. Anton received his PhD in global governance from the Balsillie School of International Affairs, which is a joint program between Waterloo and the Wilfrid Laurier universities in Canada. Anton has been advisor to the Canadian government on China-Canada economic relations and also with respect to China's innovation policies. His research has been published in the Review of International Political Economy, the Journal of Contemporary China, the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, and also in global policy. His current research is very timely in examining the impact of US-China technological rivalry on China's ICT firms. And he's also looking at the unique role of foreign and government capital in China's venture capital sector. So very hot topics, right? From 2016 to 2020, Anton was a research fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, also known as CIGI. And from 2012 to 2013, Anton was also a senior visiting scholar at the School of International Studies at Beida at Peking University. So Anton's also one of the few foreigners that were physically present in China throughout COVID, from before COVID to when COVID started to occur in China, but was still not really on the horizon elsewhere in the world, through the zero COVID travails and through the end game as well. And having lived through that myself as well, I can certainly attest to the fact that it was a unique experience that at least had the benefit of offering, I think it's fair to say, additional opportunities to garner insights into the current state of things in China, whether from an economic or indeed a sociological lens. Anton will be sharing a presentation with us. At the end, I might have a few follow-up questions, and we also welcome questions from the audience, should there be interest in submitting any. You can submit them online, and we will definitely try to get to some of them. So Anton, welcome to Edmonton.
Thank you, Philippe.
Yeah, it's great to have you here.
It's really great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for the really generous, introduction. And I just want to point out, remember when we met in Guangzhou for lunch over Chunjie, I believe, I think. And I remember looking around, and this was an area where usually it's very international sort of area, and I think we're the only foreigners here. And that really was a time. And I think in addition to rising US and more generally tensions between China and the West, it was just the fact that there was a pandemic and very few people were in there on the ground. And I think since then, a lot of misunderstandings and confusion that already existed basically was amplified.
Yes.
And I think that pretty much sets the tone for my presentation.
Yeah, if you allow me, I'll try to set the stage a little bit for the audience, and then we can move to your presentation. But on that, absolutely. And I actually recall over the course of those years, I mean, China changes very quickly all the time. And so I think anybody who's an observer of China, whether an academic or someone who's interested in China's policy or how it impacts on the West, feels the need to kind of go and do a bit of a pulse check at least every year, every 6 months if possible, or even every 2 years. But during the COVID periods, 3 or 4 years where basically very few people were coming in and out. But nevertheless, in some ways, arguably, the pace of change in China accelerated even more. And the interest in what was going on around the globe was very high. So you had a lot of people trying to opine on what was happening in China, but from the outside. And you could really sense over the years that there was a bit of a lag between what was actually happening and what even, fairly steeped, well-informed China observers were coming up with in terms of their conjectures from the outside, right? Mm-hmm. So it was I'm very glad now that it's a bit easier to move back and forth, despite the higher airplane and ticket costs. Yeah. And so hopefully that kind of dissonance, if you will, it's gonna resolve. So if we move to the topic at hand for today, I think it's a very timely one. People have been thinking about this question of whether the Chinese economy for some time, and perhaps to try to help set the stage. I'd just like to share a few thoughts right from the top, from my perspective. Right? And these are kind of impressions that I have learned and thoughts that I've kind of developed over the last 2.5 decades of observing China. And I think that the main point is I have learned personally to never underestimate the resilience of the Chinese economy. China's a continental economy. It's got a lot of diversity. Urbanization continues apace in many parts of the country. And so there's opportunity for continued growth. Innovation continues. There's certainly a lot of opportunity as well for more efficient deployment of existing capital, and much room for structural reform. China is also blessed, as many of us know, with a very industrious and entrepreneurial culture. It's got an incredibly nimble supply chain, and those of us who've had the chance to live in South China and the Guangzhou, Dongguan, Shenzhen corridor, I mean, you have to see it to believe it in terms of how nimble and quickly you can get things done there. It's got almost unparalleled infrastructure at this point as well in the key manufacturing areas. It's got improving corporate law environment, and it also, if it plays its cards correctly, has the opportunity to benefit from the tremendous potential of its rising neighbors in ASEAN and the broader region. So, over these years, I've had the chance many times, I have to say, I don't know about you, Anton, but to see infrastructure projects be launched that when they're being launched, you think this might not make so much sense because this is like overkill. But then 3, 4, 5 years later, the infrastructure is fully used. I remember, I mean, this is maybe a function of my own naivete, but if I recall when Beijing Capital Airport was a 2-lane highway and they turned it into a 6-lane highway. And I was thinking, who's going to need this, right? And now, of course, just a few years later, it was complete, traffic jam, and
not enough. There's
several ring roads trying to feed the airport. They're all full, and anyway. So that's one example. And of course, in 2nd and 3rd tier cities as well, you think, wow, especially in 2000s, 2010s, just kind of quite impressive infrastructure development that it's a bit of a field of dreams that actually you build it and they do come and things continue. So it's clearly an economy that's been on a spectacular growth trajectory. It's also a place that's shown, deep capacity to be resilient, and Chinese entrepreneurs and the Chinese people are able to withstand hardships and work through them in ways that are quite remarkable as well. So I'm definitely not going to be betting against the Chinese economy over the medium to long term. However, personally, I have to say that over the last couple of years, I've been increasingly concerned about the short to medium term prospects. Right? I see a lot of headwinds. Right? Mm-hmm. More recently, maybe there's data points like investment flows that have kind of gone negative for the first time in recent memory. Manufacturing activity, although kind of on the uptick over the last few weeks, has been kind of tentative. Consumer sentiment is clearly very cautious at this point. And maybe if we look at it at a more macro level, there's definitely increased international scrutiny as well for China's behavior. Even entities such as the EU that generally are not that good at coordinating are starting to push back and look at kind of protecting themselves from certain types of Chinese exports. And you also have, I think it's fair to say, a slow asphyxiation might be a strong word, but slow kind of strangling of Hong Kong's animal spirits as well, as the political imperatives outweigh the economic ones when it comes to the Hong Kong question. So maybe to frame it a different way, it seems to me that we're in a current era where political objectives are trumping economic ones, and that's a bit of a new phase. And although there's like lots of recipes to my mind that exist that could be put into place to ensure renewed growth, the tension between the openness that's required to implement some of those recipes and the current kind of tendency to look more towards control and security are making it very difficult for the regime to move forward in a way that would actually inspire confidence abroad, or indeed on the part of domestic entrepreneurs and consumers. So I think that's a bit of a challenge. Finally, and I know you're going to touch on this, I think, but we could also elaborate a bit later. But the perennially successful kind of card that China's played over the last 30+ years of using investment as a way to stimulate growth, I think the marginal utility of every dollar that's being put into that model is lower than it's ever been. You may or may not agree. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I also think that given the broader political context, decision makers and cadres, both nationally, but perhaps more importantly at the subnational levels, are reluctant to kind of propose new growth models, because anything new involves risk, and with a lack of clarity in terms of what types of risks are acceptable to the center, you just revert to the model that's proven to be successful, but also perhaps more importantly a model that's proven to be acceptable to the current regime. So look, I know that's fairly long stage setting, but I think given the level of interest there is for this topic, and given the multi-dimensional nature of trying to analyze it, I thought it might be helpful to just kind of lay the groundwork and pass it over to you now. Hear your thoughts. So,
excellent. Thanks so much. No, that was very comprehensive, and it saves me a bit of time in my presentation. Some points you've already touched on, so I will drill down on things that I think are very important and relevant to what Philippe just said. So can we start the slideshow? I do have some slides. I want to show some figures, just keep everybody engaged. Okay, so the first thing before we go on to slide number 2, I just want to point out, I think this was completely unintentional, but Nicholas Lardy from Peterson Institute, he just published the article that has a very similar Foreign Affairs, a very similar title. Not coordinated. I didn't take it from there. This was planned. The title was planned weeks and weeks in advance. So, but we are at this inflection point where over the past year, everybody was talking about doom. And the way I want to set this up is everyone was talking, okay, well, the Chinese growth story is done. The Chinese economy is done. China is no longer rising. And now everybody is talking about overcapacity in China's economy. In other words, then China wasn't doing enough. And now China is doing too much. Now, a lot of analysts might say that, it's precisely because things aren't good at home that China has this overcapacity. But in Q&A, we can actually maybe start to drill down on what overcapacity actually means. And in the second half of my presentation, I'm going to talk about autos and problematize that a little bit, because clearly China is producing a lot. There are some deflationary pressures, unlike here, where prices are perennially on the rise. We do have to think about a productivity story, and we do have to think about an innovation story, that this is not just China doing the same old stuff, although some of that is still present. Okay, next slide, please. So the first half of my economy, I'm just going to talk about give a general overview, and then get into the sort of the problems and the potential of China's economy. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the macro picture. So this is where I'm going to start negative. I don't want to sugarcoat it. China is undergoing a serious period of slowing growth. Now, this growth is not slowing as fast as it was portrayed, because we know 2022 was an awful year because of the lockdowns, and then 2023 China just didn't bounce back as much. And we can talk about why, people can talk about debt, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's just the fact that how much that period of lockdown scared everybody. Now you have fairly negative consumer sentiment, and consumption is growing, energy use is still growing. I mean, China's economy clearly is still growing, but we didn't get the bounce back that we expected, and everyone said, oh, well, everything is over. And it wasn't just a bounce back. Other things are happening, as I want to point out. Now, prices, we're not just talking about food prices. China is, in manufacturing, I don't want to overstress the importance of PMI, but PMI hasn't been that great. PMI is not great at the consumer level. Prices aren't rising and even falling. So, and this is happening as China is doing debt deleveraging, right? Maybe China needs some inflation, and it just can't let it. It doesn't seem to be happening just yet. And a lot of people are talking about the problem Japan had when it had its own real estate deleveraging. Right. Although I should mention Japan's real estate relative to the size of its economy and the crash itself that happened in the early 90s was worse, right? As are Japan's current debt problems in many cases.
And demographics.
And demographics. People, you do want to put things into perspective. So China also has plunging. I put the figures up there. China has this is really quite interesting, sharply slowing foreign direct investment. Now, some of that is basically because this is a picture of flows, right? Not stock. So a lot of it is actually repatriation of corporate profits, which happens for a number of reasons. You're scared about geopolitical tensions. Also, let's not discount the power of the United States Federal Reserve. Interest rates are going up. Same thing happened in the 80s. Capital is being sucked out of the rest of the world and into the United States. And that's a big macro story. And there's very little China can do about that, really. And aside from try to keep capital from leaving China, which it's, seems to be saying hell or high water, we will keep capital within China. And that's part of the things that, makes people very nervous, because they've really gone full on into, unless you're a foreigner like me, or you have a proof of your salary, you can't take money out.
Yeah.
And they've really cracked down on that. And the money that can escapes to Singapore. It's kind of they replaced Switzerland as a global offshore now. So geopolitical problems, definitely. Property market. Okay, so the property market is really an important part of this slowdown story. So China decided to pop a bubble that wasn't happening on the demand side, really, but was happening on the supply side. It was real estate developers leveraging up and borrowing more to borrow more to build more because everyone's buying a house. Now, to be honest, it's not that crazy that this was happening. Arable land in China is much lower than in a place like Canada. And China's still urbanizing, and people are still buying houses. But the amount of leverage, the degree of leverage that was going up to finance these projects, eventually something, that you weren't making enough money to pay down the debt. So the government said in a very harsh way, that's it. And now you see a lot of developers going bankrupt. A lot of, in third-tier cities, especially fourth-tier, fifth-tier, projects stall. Businesses don't get the customers because the projects aren't being completed. The construction workers are not there. This is not good, right? This is you can argue that this needed to happen, but this is not good. This is partly why you're seeing such negativity, even especially within China, about China's prospects, right? Very negative stuff, right? And of course, local government, because part of this story is they basically said to local governments, you can't rely as much.
Those issues are intertwined.
Yeah. You can't rely on land sales so much anymore like you used to. Or even if they're not telling them that, the developers aren't coming in. So local debt is really surging, and you have provinces that look quite insolvent, right? And China usually tells its provinces, look, you have to manage your own finances. Long and short of it is East Asian governments are very fiscally conservative. They're quite different from the West. And, I'll talk about other issues. Next slide, by the way.
Well, maybe we can stop there just for a sec, because it's a question I had for later, but maybe we can unpack it right away. I know it's top of mind for many. This kind of real estate collapse or bursting of the bubble, and there's several oft-cited kind of numbers, but ballpark, let's say 26-27% is kind of often what is cited in terms of the percentage of Chinese GDP that's kind of almost directly or indirectly, driven by real estate activity. Right? And so if you're going to slow that down, regardless of the kind of like the need to do so from a kind of sectoral perspective, like the spillover effects on the economy seem to be something that one should be worrying about, right? Or
no, it's really the share of real estate. A lot of people ballpark and say it's a third of Chinese growth,
right?
Which is it's not untrue. If you go to China, there's always places like Shenzhen, they're always under construction. So let me contextualize that a little bit. It's kind of like, think about Canada, Vancouver, Toronto. If there's a wider real estate price deflation or some kind of a bubble gets popped, I don't want to speculate. Are real estate prices going to collapse in Vancouver and Toronto? Maybe, but maybe not. And you're seeing the same thing in places like Shenzhen, Beijing, Shanghai. Yes, the real estate prices stopped growing and people aren't buying like before, although lately the secondary market has rebounded, but they're still building and people are still moving in because that's where people want to move into. China has this kind of leverage. They have the hukou, the household registration, and they restrict it. So they restrict people from moving in. So they have this other lever they can pull on saying, okay, more people can get hukou in these major cities.
Right.
And you think, will they actually come? Yes.
They'll come, yeah.
It's not a question of if they'll come, it's a question of how many.
But there's a good example of what I was trying to set up for you a bit earlier, where, hukou reform is actually an obvious place to go if you're trying to find ways to stimulate the economy.
Right.
But it involves a devolution of control to a certain extent.
It involves a devolution
and also the potential for social kind of like foment, if you will.
Yeah, and it's because China's economy is it's not like, they don't have the same type of fiscal federalism that we have. A lot of the welfare provisions, the education, the healthcare services, the pensions for each individual province, like what you can get in Shanghai is not the same as in if you go down to Funan province or whatever, it's just not going to be the same thing.
Right. So everyone's going to want to.
So and the thing is, if you can move to Shanghai and get access to the services, everybody will go. Yeah. So there is a social, they're not just going to eliminate hukou, but they do have to now think about reforming it more, right? So it's a political question.
So another aspect of the real estate issue, or there are several, but that I find kind of interesting is, again, beyond the need to kind of address the reform in that sector, just like everywhere around the world, but perhaps even more so in China, a lot of people's wealth is tied up into real estate. And as the price kind of starts to either plateau or even go down a little bit, it has an incredible impact on people's sentiment. And so consumers.
No, it does. It's very much
curtailed by this, and it's sometimes easier. It's very difficult to get a consumer to regain confidence once the confidence is lost, right? So beyond like the economic analysis of the sector itself, there's kind of an intangible effect as well, which is cooling the enthusiasm of the consumer, which in a context where China is actually trying to go in that direction as a counterpoint to some of the past ways of ensuring growth, that seems to me to be somewhat problematic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect segue into the slide.
Let's do it.
So to understand why this is problematic, we have to understand how China's macroeconomy works. And it works like this. China is still following a rapid catch-up growth model, regardless of what we think of how much catching up there is left to do. And I think there is a ton. Like China is not China is a high middle income economy. It's before they reach Japan levels where, if there's a
debt problem and they start to like China has a lot of room to go. There's a lot of productivity enhancements. There's a lot of improvements to people's lives, raising income to advanced economy level, where China is still fortunate that it can still do that. So and what they do, the way they do this, and they've historically done it, although is heavy investment in exports. Now, since the global financial crisis about 10 years ago, exports have become much less important. And you can take a look at some of the story on this. For example, Richard Baldwin keeps talking about how China has really deglobalized since 2008 because it's relied much more on its internal market, which is true, right? So you don't get this kind of exports driving everything like you did 2001 to 2006, which really was the story. WTO entry, that was the China shock, if you want to understand that from a broad perspective. China, in order to finance all of this catch up, China has forced savings. I don't want to go into too much detail, but rather than taking money out of people's income taxes and redistributing that, China forces people to save. Actually, they have forced savings account for healthcare and pensions. It's not taking out of taxes. It's everyone has to have a savings account as part of your income. And as a result, sorry, this is a typo. It's supposed to say consumption. Household consumption is relatively low, although I'll talk about that in a minute. It's actually probably not as low as we think. Reliance on fixed asset investment, again, that's the real estate part of it. China is still building things up. We look at China and we think, wow, there is a lot of high-speed rail. But the per capita rail in China is not as high as Korea and Japan, right? China's big. It's really, really big. So when we think about, when we think about less productive investment, we have to really break that down. What's actually productive and what's not productive? So clearly, a huge real estate build out seems less productive. Mm-hmm. Building more, but at the other end of it, building more, let's say, digital infrastructure and things that help, link cities together, that might still be quite productive. Now, maybe not at the same rate because they've really built out a lot. So you just can't double the railway network in the next 10 years and expect the same level of productivity to hold. You can't because they've already built so many, right? So this is China's issue right now. It's transitioning to a different growth area. And China, as always, I found this fascinating. It's just a low inflation story. It grows by anywhere from 5, now it's around 4 or 5%. Before that, 8 to 10%, 6%. Inflation is 1 or 2%. Yeah. And right now it's negative. It's coming up a bit, but so it's a very different story where we see prices and this inflation doesn't show up, this low level of inflation doesn't show up everywhere. I'll show you the figures on manufacturing wages, which are not that low. China is being priced out of the low end, the manufacturing sector, right? And they have a lot of these, what we call in the field, East Asian developmental state, although some people don't like to use that term. Flexible labor markets. It's not dissimilar. Places like Japan, Taiwan, Korea. They like to. We're really gonna transform our economy, go very advanced in manufacturing. That means we're gonna move labor from one industry to another. We're gonna upgrade, and skills are gonna be obsolete soon. And you see that pressure in China. And another funny thing is they have planned growth targets. Now they have a market economy with planned growth targets. This is what bothers a lot of people about it. It's hard to square that circle. They say we're gonna have 5% GDP growth, and they tell local governments they have KPI. Maybe not necessarily growth KPI, but investment and employment, whatever. And they say, compete. We need to achieve a growth target, and if they see that it's not being achieved, then the government steps in and starts investing, right? So I think a lot of the real estate developers, the remaining ones, are going to be state-owned.
Yeah,
because the private ones are collapsing. So,
but also to placate the consumers, angry consumers
who are not getting their houses
finished. Yes.
Yeah, they want to see their houses finished.
Because there's a legitimacy issue there.
Yeah, there's a huge political legitimacy issue, and they plan industrial output. The rumor is when Tesla came to Shanghai, they had Tesla promise them, because they gave them land, they gave them all sorts of perks, right? And then they said, you gotta guarantee sales and exports. It's not, we don't want you to promise, we want you to guarantee it, right? And I guess Elon's one of these few, he's a confident guy. He said, yes, I guarantee it. Yeah. It's the kind of guy he is. So that's why, probably he does so well in China. So, and they have another thing is this is the problem with real estate. Just one final thing is that they have different rules for the rural and urban economy. You can't buy and sell land freely if your designation is rural, right? So there's no market, but they're still urbanizing. And traditionally, the government would just transform that into urban land, and then you can sell it. But if local governments aren't doing as much of that, what's going to happen to all this rural land that's not on the market? So that's a big question, right? Next slide, please. And I just wanted to show, really, this slide is very quick. It's just when we talked about investment, that really relying on investment, you can really look since WTO membership what this means. Investment as a share of GDP, it went up. After global financial crisis, it was as much as 47% of gross domestic product was driven by China building things and investing in upgrading factories and things like that. So and this is when you talk about growing consumption as a part of the economy, you have to shrink this part, and from there, what's going to replace it? Because actually investment is much easier growth, right? You build things and that ups your GDP. Consumption is not always that. Consumption, you really have to have people start buying a lot. Usually that means a lot more debt, and China doesn't want debt.
And would you agree as well, despite your comments earlier, would you agree that, as you move into the 2020s, right, that the marginal utility of every dollar put into investment is going to decline,
right? Which is why you're going to see growth.
To use maybe a very simple example, the first bridge, we're here in Edmonton, right? The first bridge that was built across the Saskatchewan River was hugely accretive to the economic growth of the city, as was the second and the third. Once you're to the 16th bridge, the impact is much less, right? And that's kind of where China is in some parts of its
definitely
infrastructure.
That's especially in the hard asset real estate part.
So it's a conundrum, right?
It's a conundrum.
Try to shift to something else.
So next slide, please. So now that we've been negative for the past few minutes, let's be a little more neutral, and then we'll be positive by the end. So I want to contextualize things like that. So reasons to doubt the China sort of growth collapse or China collapse thesis. Yes, China has high government debt, total local plus central government, 250% of GDP, plus most of that from local governments, actually. It's backed by these, because local governments can't really tax, so they have to sell land, and they have these land leasing development companies called local government financing vehicles. You can read more about those. There's a ton of stuff on it. And the thing is, though, this debt is not like Canada's debt, where it's just debt and you need taxes. It's backed by collateral. Like that means the government owns land. The government owns corporations. All these local unproductive SOEs, they are assets. They have buildings. They have employees. They have R&D. They have computers. So it's not like you're saying, oh my God, this is a disaster, 250% of GDP. There are assets on the other side of it, which for advanced economies that don't have a lot of state-owned enterprises, what can you sell, right? What can you sell? The question is how you want to do privatization and the pace of it. But there are assets that back. It's not a 1-for-1. It's not like 250% debt is matched. Each dollar of debt is matched by the same by asset value at the same amount. But it's basically saying, look, debt is local. Central government doesn't historically take on a lot of debt in China, and local governments have assets to sell.
Albeit perhaps discounted. If they were to show up at the auction house with their goods and wares, they'd probably not get them.
Yeah. So, but I'm saying is, it's not like, it's really not the end of the world. So another thing is China's slowdown was self-imposed. It really was self-imposed. So they started doing things like the 3 red lines and real estate developer leverage killed, the real estate development sector. They had all these regulations on the internet sector, especially. And it's not like this, China, something happened, there was a shock, like East Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis. No, China just said by themselves, we're gonna to attack a bunch of problems that we've been meaning to attack for 10 years, but for various reasons we didn't. And so they did, and they maybe unfortunately did everything at the same time.
And they attack those problems based on a diagnostic that is purely economic?
No.
Or there's also a political
I think they're partly a political part of it too, because, you know, you know, for example, for real estate, a lot of people just couldn't afford to buy a house. And people were, China has a problem with too many savings, right? You can argue. Part of that is because people want to buy a house and they keep saving and saving and saving and saving. So you're not gonna stimulate consumption if house prices keep rising, and they were rising. And they were already very high because, again, a lot of people, not that much arable land. China's mountains and deserts, right? And all the good land is on the East Coast. And that's the most developed part of China that doesn't need more fixed asset investment. Dilemma, right? So, you know, China has capital controls and a relatively well capitalized banking system. Now that, you know, China can do what we can't do, and it's doing it now very brutally, and its capital cannot leave China. It's saying stay, right? For those that are smart enough and well connected enough, they can still get their money out, and a lot of people that were in real estate sector are moving it, you know, to Singapore.
And anecdotally, I'd say the pressure on that dike is greater than ever right now.
No, that's what I mean. We don't have data, but anecdotally, I've heard stories which I'm not going to share now.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, I've heard some very.
But it's fair to say that, you know, the pressure is there.
You can't take money out.
Yeah.
You can't take money out. So that's, you know, it's managing its problem with ways that other countries cannot. So there also had recent changes in policies, you know, those policies starting private sector firms are, I would say, they're not as harsh as frequently portrayed. So for a couple of reasons. Number one is a lot of those things that they did to the internet firms, like saying you can't use data that you collected for reasons that you're not saying you're collecting it for. Doesn't that sound familiar? That's exactly what we're dealing with. That's what, you know, maybe the way they did it, and I've talked to some tech firms that, you know, the way they did it was really harsh, but the actual act of doing it, this is not some crazy thing. For example, and a lot of the reasons that the private sector has been so disproportionately affected is because the private sector, especially the real estate developers, are more leveraged. So when China is deleveraging, the private sector is going to get hit a lot harder, especially SOEs have lifelines to banks that private sector firms usually do not.
Yeah.
So actually, it's not that China said we're going to kill the private sectors. They're not doing that. It's just the way that things are working out. It's hitting the private sector harder, right? And so again, China has, what we're seeing fundamentally in the growth slowdown, it's lost the growth momentum from real estate. And that's not coming back. Like, we should just get used to that. You know, we shouldn't panic about it and saying, oh no, China is going to go to 4% growth. That's disaster. No, that's normal. It's not gonna, the problem, you know, China wants to shift to consumption, but it also doesn't want to totally rely on consumption because you're not going to get the bang for the buck of investment. So, but growth drivers, so we can go to the next slide, are not tapped out. The first thing I want to say is a lot of people point to this figure that China has a very low share of household consumption as a share of GDP. You know, first of all, it's, you know, not lower than Singapore, right, or Ireland. But actually, that's because China uses different metrics. You can follow the link. It uses different metrics to calculate its consumption, and it actually undercounts. So if you were using OECD, rich country standards, which is difficult to do in China for various reasons we can get into Q&A, actually its household consumption is not that low. The other thing is, think about this figure. Households save 35% of their disposable income. How many Canadian households save 35% of their disposable income? That's, you know, and that's middle, you know, and the wealthier you are, the more you save. People think, oh, that's because of, you know, incomes are not enough. No. Actually, incomes are not bad. It's the fact that real estate is so expensive, and the fact that China has an developed sort of welfare state that households save a lot. And, you know, even if you develop the welfare state, like in Shanghai, Shenzhen, places like that, they have better provision. households still save 35% of their income, because incomes, the cost of living, China still has less developed parts of China, and it still has migrant labor. Cost of living is just much lower. You're gonna save what you don't spend, and people in China save a lot.
I would argue there's a confidence dimension to this now as well. And it kind of goes back to it's a bit of a paradox. Goes back to, you're saying, when real estate prices were always on the rise, people couldn't afford, so they needed to save.
Yeah.
Now that prices are actually have inflected and are actually kind of going down.
They're afraid. They're afraid.
Now they actually don't want to buy because they're afraid that the prices are going to continue to go down.
Yeah, because that's part of their.
And so it's a bit of a conundrum.
It's a conundrum, and also wages are not going up right now because again, they're used to wages.
And anecdotally, it's not just the consumers, right? I also have heard from entrepreneurs, small, medium, and large-sized companies. They're basically on the sidelines when it comes to putting their investment plans into action.
Yeah.
They're waiting.
They're waiting.
They're playing it safe.
Yeah.
But that all has a snowball effect on economic.
Yeah. For sure. And we'll talk about later what China could do and what it's not doing, why it's not doing that. But we can go to the next slide now. So let's talk about some positives. So what's going to replace the real estate sector? Well, for now, the industrial sector, right? All the monthly change in bank loans is here. You can actually just pull that up from the People's Bank of China, the English language website. You can see right when the real estate deleveraging started in 2021, 2021, you basically had loans shift from real estate to, actually the shifting already started before. I've had conversations with some people that exited the real estate finance side of that sector. They told me, look, I got out in 2019 because the writing was already on the wall before the government policies.
Right.
And every bank started shifting their loans to the industrial sector. So take a look at what that means. I just pulled up an article from FT from I guess a couple of months ago. A Chinese EV set to take 25% of the European market this year, and it's not. And by the way, the subsidies that they used to give to these companies, they're being pulled out. This is now increasingly a market phenomenon. This is I'll talk about the price war that's going on in this sector. It's actually amazing. So next.
And those of us, I mean, I think it's worth making the point as well. Not only, like, both you and I have had the chance to interact with the BYDs and the CATLs of this world, and their innovative capacity is very impressive, and their technological drive and the quality of their products too. But just like it's hard for folks who haven't had a chance to go to China recently to realize, like, I don't know about you, but when I was in Guangzhou, if an ICE engine, if an internal combustion engine rolled down the street, a vehicle with a gas engine, I would notice it because it was an outlier, right? The prevailing kind of vehicles were EVs, right? Whereas here you're still noticing the EVs because they're definitely a minority of cars.
Yeah.
And so it's a complete shift.
The shift is
hard to appreciate how far ahead they are from, with the possible exception of Tesla, pretty much every other manufacturer in Europe and North America.
Right. People just don't believe, like, I'll say something interesting. People in North America don't believe that you can have an affordable EV. The joke that BYD is made about themselves is, for those, not everyone speaks Chinese, but they said we are now BOD, like cheaper than oil.
Yeah.
They do make cars cheaper than ICE. Like the entry level is, they have I forget the model, $12,000 US for an entry level EV. People here think EV, that's $60,000. No, it's not. No, it's not in China. And it's not, you're thinking, they're
not bad cars.
They're not bad cars.
Yeah.
Tesla is now worried because when their competitors were the legacy. Elon was confident.
Yeah.
Now he's not, because he knows that inside China, there are real competitors. And it used to be, well, we're on the high end and they're on the low end, so we're not afraid. Not anymore. All of these Chinese EV manufacturers are releasing high-end models that Huawei is good. This is just the crazy stuff. Huawei is competing with Tesla, and they're selling like crazy, right? Just and it's because that's the auto sector, right? It's total transformation.
Before we go to the next slide, or maybe we can stay with this slide, but one more question on vehicles. I'm just curious, because that way we won't need to talk about it later. 25% exports to Europe. You saw that on the last slide.
Yeah.
But we also hear now rumblings of kind of pushback, right? Whether there's bit of it or not, whether steeped in fact or not, right? We're going to see a reaction.
Right.
And is that going to, hamstring this projected growth? Are we going to end up with a chart here that's actually going to slow down in terms of?
I doubt it. I doubt it because you have to decompose what these exports are. A lot of them.
But on EVs in particular.
So EVs, actually a lot of the exports are ICE cars by legacy automakers that they can't sell in China. And they're just dumping them because at very low prices. And sometimes you're buying a car made in China that was not supposed to be made in China because the tariffs are so high in the vehicle sector, but they can't sell them. No one's buying them. And they're just like, we gotta do something with these, and people in China aren't buying them, but people abroad are, so we're gonna pay the tariffs and ship them out.
But those aren't the cars going to Europe.
Some of them are.
Some of them are.
They're going everywhere. You might see them here. No, but the EVs, the issue is, yes, they're exporting some, but a lot of that is actually Tesla. Because they specifically are, Tesla has a few gigafactories and they export all around the world, and that's what they do. So that's number one. Number two, some of that is BYD, but BYD wants to localize. So the question is, big question is, who's going to let them and to what extent? If we did to China what the West did to Japan and say you have to build it here, then you can actually then basically there wouldn't be much headwinds. It'd just be a matter of time before they localize. But is it made in China that we're afraid of, or made by China? Because if it's made by China, no one's going to let them build here.
Yeah, that's the issue at this point. That's
the issue. But actually, their biggest growing markets are in Southeast Asia. Not Europe is big, and Europe actually is letting them build, like Eastern Europe, Hungary, places like that. Mexico is letting them set up. They like Latin America. They like Europe a little bit, definitely. But actually, a lot of the European sales are Chinese-owned European brands like Volvo, Zeekr. They own a whole bunch of European brands too. So you might not even notice it. You might think you're buying a European car, but it's actually Chinese. Now, next slide. So one really quick thing I wanted to mention, people used to like to look at this Li Keqiang index because they don't trust China's GDP numbers. And what's the Li Keqiang index? It looks at freight volume, it looks at energy consumption, and I'm blanking on the third. But in any case, it doesn't look at actual GDP growth. And during the WTO and post-global financial crisis years, like people like to look at it because we don't trust the government's numbers, and so we're going to look at other metrics. And by those metrics, you don't trust the government's numbers. Take a look. Happened in 2024. You can see the 2022 collapse.
Yeah. It aligns.
And you can see the sluggish growth in 23 in there too.
Yeah.
But now it's going back up. So again, if you want to,
it aligns with the latest manufacturing numbers.
It does.
Yeah.
It actually aligns with the latest manufacturing numbers. And I have a colleague that it's in the energy consulting sector. He looks at the energy consumption numbers, and it looks like this. So we can go down to the next slide. No need to stay here too long. And again, so this is another interesting thing because we all know that Wall Street's been pulling their money out. For China, the stock market is in really bad shape. Not as bad as Hong Kong, but pretty bad shape. And you can see that. But lately, they've been, some of them have been trying to buy the dip in finance terms.
Is this the Ray Dalio effect? I don't know if you saw he came out with something a few days ago.
He's definitely doing
saying this is the time to go back in.
And UBS just they leased half of a building in Hong Kong. Now they leased the full building. So some people are trying to buy the dip, and it's because of things that we're talking about here. Headwinds. Everyone is selling. But if you want to think long term, this is the time to buy.
It's the Warren Buffett approach.
Yeah, but this is the time to buy. It's not when everything's going up, but it's the time to buy is now.
If you're convinced by the arguments you're making here.
Yes, you might have to suffer for a few years, but guys like Dalio, they have the cash to suffer for a few years.
Yeah.
Anyway, next slide. And that was a Goldman Sachs chart. I didn't make that. So let's dig down into some things before we go into Q&A. So next slide, please. Okay, I want to just drill this into everyone's, mind. Cheap China.
low quality goods, low wages, things that people associate with China. We have an election campaign in the US, Canada. You're going to hear allusions to this. Your arguments are 15 years out of date to make this argument. Cheap China is dead. Actually, we're looking at, Apple's moving its manufacturing out. It's not just Apple. This started with Chinese manufacturers moving manufacturing out. Wages are they're higher than Mexico. They're moving into Mexico, right? Manufacturing wages are not low. China is automating at a breakneck pace because they can't find, the cheap, like the low, like the Foxconn assembling your iPhones. That's on the way out, and that's actually a natural process. It's just that it's happening really fast in China. China's really still far from the frontier in terms of, we think, electric cars and high-speed rail. Go to a third and fourth and fifth tier city. See what it looks like. This is where the huge growth is going to come from. You still have places in China that really look, when you go there, you're like, this is a developing country. Then you go to Shenzhen and you're like, this is not a developing country. And that gap closing is what's going to get you growth. It's not going to be more consumption, although China needs that. It's not going to be more welfare provision, which is a good thing long term, but short term, it's not going to get you any. We see that. You can give more healthcare, whatever, people are still going to save. That's a different type of behavior. Now, the regulatory crackdown on tech is now 3 years old, and there's no new measures. And they know that they've scared people, and they're trying to woo entrepreneurs back in. They're trying to, foreign investment. They had this meeting with American, with Wall Street and other, transnational company, CEOs. Like, they know that they scare people. Real estate. And this is what I was getting into, was a short-term boost to growth, but it's a long-term drag on economic productivity because it's just not that productive. You're getting growth out of, at the beginning it was if you look at the way that we used to build, it was all manual labor, but now everything is done. A lot of it is with machines, the same amount of construction workers. You have machinery that you already bought. And the more you build, there's no productivity boost from that. Like, it's not like there's some kind of a robot that replaces all construction workers and does things really fast. I don't know, maybe in 20 years, I don't know. It's not happening now. And it's just, you're not getting it's a short-term boost, but long-term, it does nothing for your productivity. So it's not a bad thing that it's slowing down. And this is my personal thing, and I think there's a lot of potential in the service economy. That's the weakest part of China's economy. If you look at the quality of basic services in places in advanced economies, Canada, Europe, it's just much better because China is used to concentrating on manufacturing and things like that. They're not used to thinking about services. Like, if a company wants to buy software here to make things more productive and save on labor and time, a lot of Chinese companies don't think like that. They just think, I don't want to pay for software. I don't want to, I'm going to just hire a bunch of people and then they're going to do things. Yeah, it's going to be pretty bad, but that doesn't matter. We don't care about that. Services have a lot of potential for growth. So next slide. I just wanted to show the average yearly wages in the manufacturing sector in China. Just to put that into context, 100,000, renminbi, just below 20,000, I guess, Canadian dollars or American dollars per year for an economy where the, per capita income is much, 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 much lower, 5 times lower than in Canada. This is not an abnormally low wage, right? This is why you have manufacturing shifting out of certain kinds of manufacturing shifting out of China. People say, China is because low wages. No, it's not. Wages really are not that low in China. They're relatively low in services. Like, that's where they could be a lot higher. And that's, again, because the quality and productivity in service sectors is great. Like, if they do more, and some companies are trying, right? But it's a difficult transition to make. Like, the Japanese, if you want to talk about Japan risk, the Japanese took like 20, 30 years to improve this. Because the East Asian growth model doesn't think like that. They think of making things. We don't care about making things, which is why we can't build anything in time. Japan, take a look at, TSMC in Arizona. 2027, they might have the facility up, maybe, we'll see. By then, Japan will have two of more equally advanced or more advanced facilities up. Because that's just their focus, right? They like to focus on building things, because that's what pulled them out of poverty historically, and very, very fast, right? So next slide, please. So, and the election, just to put this into perspective, in 2013, in 2013, I think 2024, they have 20 million. This is out of date. They have 20 million electric vehicles by end of 2023 on the road. Look at if you don't believe me that the adaptation has been rapid, just the jump from 2020 to 21, and there was an equal jump in 22 when there were lockdowns and what were they doing? What was the 2 or 3% growth from it? People were buying
car showrooms.
Their car showrooms were everywhere. That was kind of funny. That not even dealership. They don't even do deal except for BYD. Nobody.
All the restaurants and the bars were closed, so you go to the car showroom.
Go to the car showroom, right? And they offer you, trade in your old car. And another reason for this, it's funny because they don't give licenses for ICE cars, or you have to play a lottery or wait 10 years. But if you buy an electric car, which is now being phased out because everyone's buying them. Oh, you don't have to wait. You get a car license plate, right? And the replacement has been so fast that a lot of governments have had to pull this perk, and because you want to reduce traffic, and you're putting more cars on the road than you're taking out with these electric vehicles. People really are buying them. And not just wealthy individuals, because they're affordable. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. That's just the title slide. So I want to go. How am I doing for time?
You're doing great. Yeah.
How much longer do I have?
I give you another 10 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. So I want to put things into perspective of how I see things moving forward. So from think about it from made in China to made by China, right? So 1980s to 1990s, this was the introduction of made in China. Beginning of urbanization, low-end manufacturing, and basically import substitution, because this is the beginning of this so-called policy like joint ventures. People like that as forced technology transfer. If you want to.
Is that still happening?
Not really, because
no one's willing to transfer anymore.
No, because first of all, no one was ever willing to transfer frontier technology, and China is going to the frontier, so there's nothing left to transfer. If you take a look at Volkswagen and Ford have had joint ventures for 20 or more years, and
it was always quite amusing to see the Santana, which is basically the Volkswagen Fox from 15 years before on the roads in North America.
And the thing is and it's not like you had a copy of a Toyota Corolla that really made it. No, they never transferred their high-end stuff. These joint ventures were very beneficial for big automakers. What they got was a captive market that was controlled by SOEs. And they were, at one point Ford made more money from China than it did in the United States. It was really, and so they didn't have to transfer their latest stuff. But now that story is out. Tesla was the first company to go in without a joint venture. And actually Tesla's strategy, like a lot of these companies, is very smart. Microsoft did that. You're gonna open up, and Microsoft just let people copy because they couldn't do anything about it. But now everyone's using Microsoft, right? And now they're charging for it. But Tesla, they opened up. Elon said, okay, all our patents belong to you or whatever. We're going to open up our platforms. And you think, oh, he's not being nice. What he's doing is he's forcing everyone to develop a supply chain and technological platforms that benefit them. So basically, he's forcing everyone to follow Tesla's lead rather than creating their own ecosystem where they can compete and have their own walled gardens. He's saying, no. Everyone's going to do what we're doing. And that worked very, very, very well. But that's
is it working now?
No,
it's BYD, CATL, and friends. They've kind of
even Geely, some of the legacy ones. No, the thing is now. The problem is now. I think maybe now Tesla has two headwinds. One is EV adaptation in North America has just collapsed.
And techno-nationalism.
Techno-nationalism. So he didn't expect it to happen, I guess. And two, China, he underestimated, I think, how much companies can withstand the price war that he launched. So he's part of the reason Teslas are getting cheaper is because he started this price war in China where he lowers and then, he's like, we're going to sell, because Tesla is a premium. Chinese consumers love Tesla and no one's going to be able to lower it without going out of business. They'll keep lowering. Everyone is fighting this price war. A lot of car companies, the startups are dropping out.
Yeah.
You probably never heard of them and I never heard of them, but they're dropping out. But the big guys are still there. They're fighting the same price war. And to understand, this all happened starting from the 2000s, but in the 2010s, this is where this is the Tesla story, scale, right? China had developed a big domestic market, so it wasn't relying so much on the world market. What happens is you scale in China, you get enough production, and then at the margin, you start to export. Like 80s and 90s, you export everything. Nothing was for China because nobody could afford or had any need for what they were manufacturing. But now they do. Now China is largely, and that's normal for a big economy. The United States also doesn't trade at my energy self-sufficient. If China was energy self-sufficient, it wouldn't trade as they have to import a lot, right? They probably wouldn't be importing as much if they were energy self-sufficient. So, and today you have all of these things that, growth today is basically going to be driven by not only scale, but innovation. So new energy vehicles, that's new technology. By the way, they're not just copying Tesla. It's actually, the reason that EVs take off so well in China, and you can see this with the legacy automakers, is legacy automakers tend to do, they don't emphasize software because they're not good at that. Chinese, just like Tesla, Chinese EV makers, it's a software, a car is a computer.
Yeah.
And so they started doing that like 10 years ago. They started thinking about that 10 years ago. And it's now, you're saying, oh, China doesn't innovate. But it's the legacies that are catching up. Even Tesla now is catching up because the features in some of these Chinese cars are better.
Yeah.
The features are better than Tesla. Like Tesla is worried because at first they were ahead. Not anymore. You go into any Chinese car, the features are as good or better than Tesla. So that's that. Plus, some of these things, I find it kind of funny. Some of the innovation is externally imposed. Like in my research, for example, I look at semiconductors. They would keep buying foreign semiconductors because even though they're expensive, it's cheaper than developing your own. But we're not allowed to sell them advanced semiconductors. So they're going to make them by themselves. Now, are they going to be, they're still going to be years behind us, but we gave companies that were behind a captive market. We gave it to them because you can't import advanced chips for companies like Huawei, so they're going to make their own. And how are they going to do that? Scale. China has scale. They're going to sell cars and make money selling cars and use that to subsidize semiconductor development. They're selling phones again. They're selling cars. They're profitable, right? They're not the only company. All these Chinese companies, they have to subsidize. It's not just the government that's telling them. They have to think about. Remember we had the chip shortage with the automobiles during the pandemic. So it's not even just geopolitics, it's supply chain issues. They're thinking about that, thinking, what if there's another chip shortage for autos? No, BYD make their own chips for that reason. They're thinking, no, we're not going to rely on others because it's too scary. Toyota created just in time, BYD created just in case. We might be talking about that in 10, 20 years time, right? So, and then let's go to the next slide, please. I just want to conclude. So another big question is people have, what is industrial policy in China? Think about it in three ways. A lot of industries it fails in, a lot of industries it succeeds in. So the way it works is you have some import substitution. That usually doesn't work. Then you go to global competitiveness, and then you go to market-based import substitution, which is what's happening with EVs now. It's a lot of trial and error. Like semiconductors the industrial policy wasn't working in semiconductors until all of these external shocks. And by the way, autos, the same thing. They've been investing in EVs and batteries for like 15 years. Tesla came in, and the government basically said, look, we're not protecting you anymore, and we're going to take the best company in terms of EVs, and we're going to give them money, and good luck, right? And so that's you have the external shock, and that determines whether industrial policy is successful. Now, is that unique? No.
Sometimes you get lucky too. I mean, some of the, when you get a Robin Zhang or Chairman Wong at the BYD, driving innovation,
it's not even just
exogenous.
I actually would argue EVs are a little bit lucky, because all these foreign executives for 3 years couldn't go to China, and we would tell them, like, guys, you're screwed, and they're like, oh, come on.
That's very true. Yeah.
Come on, like BYD, no, come on. No. And then you go there, and then they went there in 23 for the Shanghai Auto Show, and they went, oh crap. Because no one was showing up to the booths.
It's been like no one was listening to us on many things.
Yeah. And we're like, guys, you have to see, please just we'll show you a video of what's on the road. We'll show you those showrooms. And they're like, no, that's just temporary. We'll bounce back. And now they have to do joint venture partnerships with Chinese automakers, because they're like, we can't catch up, because they missed 3 years, right, of product cycle development. They missed 3 years, right? There's many failures. It's not like, China. China is not. It's not like a lot of what they're gonna do. They're gonna fail at. It's trial and error. And a lot of the easy growth is done. We shouldn't be scared. Like, this is not some kind of unstoppable juggernaut. I spent the first half of the presentation talking about all the problems that could derail them, right? But we shouldn't, basic message for my presentation is China is not 3 feet tall, and they're not 10 feet tall. Think about it rationally. They're a big economy, right? They're a resilient economy. They have a lot of policy levers that we don't have. They have a lot of problems that we don't have either. Like in Canada, we're lucky. Look how much land we have, natural resources. We don't have that. We don't have any of that. Why are they, they're basically forced into relationships with Russia, Iran, UAE, whatever. Right? They don't have our energy, right? They need it. And by the way, they're building coal capacity as they're greening their grid. Why are they doing that? Most of it is idle. If there's a war, they're going to ramp up coal production.
Right.
Right. Ontario, for example, can say, oh, we're not using any more coal. There's no province in China that has that luxury, because it gets too hot, it gets too cold, and all of a sudden, the grid goes out. Like they need emergency. They can build nuclear, but that's slow, even in China. Right? And nuclear is slow everywhere, right? So they're not unstoppable. Far from it. They're not unstoppable. Next slide. What do I have? I think I'm done, but oh yeah, one more thing. FDI inflows collapsed. Outflows. Some of that is like people hiding money, but some of that is Chinese companies who are, because they see things slowing down in China, and they tapped out their scale. It's way too competitive in China, just absurdly competitive in a lot of these sectors. Especially there's a deflationary sort of price war in many sectors. They want to invest abroad, because an EV in China can go for $20,000 US, and the same EV can go for $40,000 or $50,000 in Europe. They want a part of that, right? Southeast Asia is a welcoming market. Latin America is a welcoming market. Middle East is a welcoming market. They want to go out. China, they're not going to get the same growth in China as they did before. Next slide. Very quick conclusions. They're in a slower growth phase. Investment won't yield growth like before. And consumption, despite what people, a lot of people, I disagree with them about this. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to change everything. It's not going to end overcapacity, however you want to define that. Consumption just won't get them, won't get them where you think it's going to get them. And people's consumption behaviors won't just change because you give them better healthcare. It just won't. Like there's a structural dynamic of why people save in China. And at the same time, we've been here before. Like, can we just pause about the collapse talk? And I came to China in 2012 for the first time to live, and it was collapsing then. Then as I was leaving, 2015, it was collapsing again. And then
I didn't think so. Who was saying that?
Oh, there's because they unified the exchange rate with the renminbi, and the stock market collapsed just like now, and everyone was saying it's collapsing. But it collapses every couple of years. I think eventually we gotta just we got to step back and say, like, how many times does it have to collapse before we realize it has to collapse? Yeah, just I don't think it's going to collapse. There is no, we could see a Japan-like situation, but China is lower at a per capita income than much lower than Japan was in the 1990s. Japan just couldn't grow its way out of its problems, and it ended up. How did Japan sort of solve its problems? Well, it started to nationalize its debt, its private debt, and it's still not growing after it did that, right? So, and China's just not there technologically. They're not there in terms of their macro phase, right? And so we really shouldn't, that last thing, we really shouldn't downplay their social, economic, and political problems. Like, I don't want to say everything is rosy. It's not. But we don't want to read too much into it. You want to take a longer term perspective on this. If things are going to be bad for the next few years, okay, they'll be bad in the next few years. Does it mean that the story is over? I don't think so. And that's it.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Anton. I do personally think that you've offered us a lot of context and I think some avenues to reflect on in terms of China's future trajectory, and a fairly balanced point of view as well. So, not sugarcoating it, as you said. So that's fantastic. You did a great job too. I gave you 10 minutes. You took 11, so we still have some time for some questions. I think what I'd like to do is, I don't know who's tracking the questions in the UR. Do we have several or?
Yeah, we have some.
Okay, so what I'd like to do then is I'd like to do a few quick hits myself, right? So I'm going to throw a few tough questions at you, but let's just do them semi-rapid fire. Let's give ourselves 10 minutes, and then we'll give 10 minutes for Q&A if necessary. The purpose here is not necessarily for the two of us to kind of answer those questions comprehensively, but just maybe throw a few other items out there for our audience to have a chance to think about as well.
Mm-hmm.
So number one, demographics, right? So we kind of like touched on that tangentially, but is that a critical problem for China? Is it a manageable problem for China, or actually could it even be seen as a bit of a potential blessing in disguise, or it's all three at the same time?
Yeah, let me try to answer that. This is one of the most, it's not just the China question, by the way. So demographics are an issue in all industrial, sort of post-industrial service economies. People aren't having babies. There was a huge collapse with the lockdowns. Let's just, might bounce back, but I don't know. Demographics is one of the worst things to predict of how it might impact things, because before everyone was talking about, in the 90s, everyone was talking about overpopulation. Now everyone's talking about underpopulation. How it's going to affect things? It's going to, I can tell that it's going to affect automation, labor costs and automation. It's going to so China has two choices. They can do what Japan does, is try to keep labor costs down as the society is aging. They can let them go up a bit, and that they have room to do that. And automation is an important part of doing something about that shrinking labor force, but we don't really know what it takes. We are really just gazing decades into the future. We won't know. It won't really bite until 20 years from now.
Okay, so that's great. I'd maybe add, let's say we haven't talked about the ecology, the environment in China. I think from an ecological perspective, actually, a China of 800 or 900 million is probably more sustainable, and solves a lot of challenges that are actually undermining the central government's legitimacy as well. So, so you can see how that there's good and bad, and also just throw this out, and this is certainly not a topic for the next 12 minutes, but there is an escape valve as well that's not being used at all in China, as in some other Asian societies in particular, but that's immigration. Right? And so you could see how perhaps 10, 15, 20 years down the road, there may be a little bit of openness in terms of bringing in a little bit more foreign labor and addressing some of the
I mean, I really don't think it's the immigration The demographic story is not my favorite in terms of saying how things are bad. That's why I left it out. I don't think
But
that's,
you've seen how in the last couple of years, you know, with maybe India overtaking China in population, it triggered all these commentaries about how, you know, this is the beginning of the end, or, you know, speculation about how to. So I think it's important to continue to kind of
we should keep an eye on it.
Discuss
It's
that
interesting.
Okay, so let's move on to another one. Innovation, right? Hard to do a quick hit on innovation, but you know, you were quite eloquent in terms of outlining how Chinese industries have demonstrated quite adroit and skills and are quite agile in terms of innovative capacity. But there's a broader debate behind that, you know, as to whether a lot of that innovation remains what, you know, for lack of a better term, what I might call incremental innovation, as opposed to kind of like fundamental basic science innovation. I think the jury's still out to some extent on whether China is able to come up with the big breakthroughs at the basic level, or whether they're just very good at adapting and refining more quickly than some of their competitors in the West. You know, the big breakthroughs that actually came from the West in the first place. First part of the question. And the second part is, you're on campus, you're in the social sciences, of course, but you know, instinctively to me, I do feel like there's the environment is a little bit more tight, a little bit more controlled than it used to be. And is that going to be a damper in terms of you know, where innovation is supposed to happen is in part in universities and institutes, and if people are a little bit more cautious or their environment is a little bit more constrained, is that also a risk? So yeah.
Yes, very simply. I mean, I think they're aware of that risk. I think they're wondering what to do about it, because there's two dynamics. One is innovation and openness. Actually, they've been really trying, like they did all this visa relaxation, and you know, they did all. They're you know, I think they're serious when they want to continue to open up. It's just a question about the pace. But at the same time, what you're seeing there, and you're seeing this unfortunately everywhere too, maybe more seriously in China, because of the nature of what China's, you know, the way that China's government operates in their current situation, is national security is everything. Things that you didn't, you know, things that you didn't necessarily consider to be national security, like, you know, now, you know, you can't buy an electric car because it's a computer on wheels and they're going to deactivate it. We're talking about that. They're talking about that too.
Yeah.
They have more, you know, they're trying to keep an eye on everyone, that nobody, you know, that researchers don't start, you know, don't go off on their own too much and things like that. This is all definitely a negative for innovation. I think they're saving graces. I think a lot of countries are doing similar, not to the same degree, but they're doing similar things. I would say this is bad for innovation everywhere.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I don't, you know, I think we have to watch what happens. They're trying to maintain control as they're making a huge transition, because they know about all the negatives that I talked about today. They're trying to make a transition because they know that things are going to get worse and they don't want them to get out of control. Now, the way they do things, a lot of people in the West would completely disagree with, right? So we have to keep an eye on that. So as far as like foreigners coming in to do innovation, it's going to be harder, because we're going to come in there, we're like, well, we're not comfortable with this, right? But at the same, you know, but they got a lot of people domestically. They're graduating tons of people who need jobs, and they can't find jobs here. And by the way, we won't give it to them, even if they were qualified.
Okay, so there you go. That's on innovation. There's some new nomenclature now that's kind of coming out a bit more, new productive forces, all this kind of stuff. Is that a bit of a Pollyannish kind of objective, given what seems to be the need for like a lot of state capital as opposed to private capital to be deployed in its service? Or
I thought
is it worth paying attention to at all?
Yeah, it is.
As a nomenclature or terminology.
I think new productive forces is talking about getting ahead rather than catching up. This is their language of saying we're not going to grow as fast, and we have to figure out a way to lead the world in certain industries rather than just focus on scale and catching up.
Right.
And it's, things like making things more digital, and rather than focusing on like internet platforms, we want, a lot of these internet platforms, they're very good for making life more convenient, but they're not really good for like migrant workers who need a steady job with a good pay, because it's completely precarious labor. I mean, just like it is here, right?
Well, let me give you a number. Like, I think I was looking at this just a couple days ago. It just struck me. The plans are to basically back this up with 1.6 trillion USD of funding,
money,
right? So, by definition, that means a lot of this money is going to be flowing through SOEs. It's going to be state directed. This may or may not be the most efficient use of capital.
Well,
like the R&D sector, where it's very formidable, but perhaps not optimized.
Yeah. So that's another thing. So yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, the thing also about money flowing in China, because the banking system is largely state-owned, and a lot of the money that's going to be invested, like a lot of the like where are you going to get money? Like if so the SOEs would be the ones that are investing in these private equity and venture funds because they have the capital, right? And it would be like, it's the Chinese pension funds, state-owned, right? The banks are state-owned, so all the money is fundamentally. So the government says it's not like this is not going to be we have to also think about this. It's not going to be necessarily a fiscal thing. It's not like the government is going to start handing out money. They're going to do it through the banking sector. They're going to do it through these government guidance funds, which are funds of funds that invest. They actually, a lot of the times, they have private investors manage this state money, but it's still state money. They're trying to be more efficient. Like before, local government said, oh, I talked to one local government. They said, we didn't know what we were doing. We invested in a failing real estate company because they sold us on their innovation, right? So that now they're trying to do something with that. So for example, the NIO, that car company, they got it was an interesting thing they did. The local government, what's the city? I'm blanking on it, but it's very important.
It's in Anhui, isn't it?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Hefei. So Hefei basically said, look, we're going to do an equity injection, and we're going to sort of give you a lifeline, and we're going to sell, right? So they didn't just they made money on this. And the stipulation was bring your headquarters production, everything here. So it's going to be things like this. It's going to be, and some of it is going to be more wasteful stuff, because not every local government
and we'll see if NIO survives. Actually,
yeah,
they're burning cash like crazy.
Yeah,
as is Xiaopeng as well.
Okay, if they survive.
So that's very helpful. More food for thought on that. Okay, a couple more quick hits, and then we can turn to some questions. Decoupling and de-risking, right? So I'd like to maybe narrow the focus. So it's not about reshoring into North America or Europe, but let's look at Southeast Asia. And part of the reason for that is maybe a little self-promotion here, but some of our team is doing a really deep dive into the nature of the interconnection between China and Southeast Asia in terms of manufacturing and supply chains, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you'd mentioned about labor costs, et cetera. So do you see any trends emerging there? Is China going to also, friendshore into Southeast Asia? North America is trying to do it. Europe is trying to do it. Do you see an emerging dynamic there? Any insights?
Mm-hmm. So number one, it's not just like friendshoring. For them, it's also about it's also about finding other markets. So they're not just locating there. They actually want to sell there too.
Right.
So this is a different China. It's no longer just like for export processing or whatever. They're setting up in Indonesia, for example, and Indonesia is making them localized, and the idea is they want to sell there. They want to do the same in even Brazil, right? In Mexico.
And export from there as well.
Of course.
But do you think that that's where the made by China thing might actually become a bit of an albatross down the road?
Yes.
In certain sectors.
In certain sectors.
Okay.
And also because, it's very hard to track, because we're everyone's doing this friendshoring and de-risking, but we're not really deglobalizing as much as we think. So the globalized supply chains are still there. It's just that they might pass through Southeast Asia rather than coming out of China directly. And right, especially with US tariffs, everyone's incentivized to do that to avoid tariffs, right?
Okay, I want to bring it back to North America before I move to some questions from the audience. Let's start with the US. So we got an election coming up, right? Certainly from a foreign policy perspective, one could expect a Trump administration to be markedly different than a Biden one. But from a trade policy perspective, especially with respect to US-China trade, personally, I think that we overplay the impact that Trump might have, and that Biden hasn't really been that soft on China.
Right.
Do you see any potential paths forward there, trends that you can predict?
I mean,
one way or another.
The one thing is, the question is how much Donald Trump is going to
Triple down.
No, how much on the national security angle is he going to push with China? Because if he pushes really hard, then that might change things. But if he just continues what Biden, like he might just continue what Biden was doing,
or double it.
Yeah. I mean, but the thing is, China is already is accounting for that. Like part of what China has been, part of this whole resilience and new productive forces is also about mitigating these kinds of risks. I don't know. This is the hardest question, honestly. Trump is a wild card, and also there's an election, so things that are said now won't necessarily be done. And if the Democrats win re-election, right now they're kind of slowing down their anti-China stuff.
So let's say Trump came into power and decided to double his his tariffs on China.
But that won't do anything.
So what is the net impact?
Nothing, because everything's done from Southeast Asia anyway. That might make Southeast Asia even more important.
Right.
I mean, we might have to really pay attention to what happens in Southeast Asia. And if he starts to press, like put tariffs on them too and put more tariffs on Europe, then we're talking about a global situation where it's not just China we have to worry about. Like that's what I'm saying, that it's a wild card. That's not just a China only story, because he's not only going to focus on China. There's the question of the Middle East and Europe as well, which he's promised to do some pretty radical things, right? So we'll have to wait and see. Like we all have to be careful.
And finally, with respect to China-Canada, do you have any thoughts about the current state of the relationship? Anything that Canada could do in order to advance its interests, either politically, economically, commercially, going forward?
I mean, Canada should, as it always does, look what happens south of the border. Canada could actually be a little bit proactive and keep channels open. We can't do too much, but we can. I don't think we should close our doors. We shouldn't close our doors to research collaboration. We shouldn't close our doors to, like when we look at electric vehicles, we maybe, we have to find a way to talk to the United States in such a way that doesn't preclude Chinese electric vehicles from being totally kept out of our market. Like we should think carefully about what we wish for if you were talking about that, because we also have manufacturing jobs.
Yeah, and it's interesting. For example, CATL actually, I believe, was looking at Canada as a potential destination, but for various reasons started to look elsewhere. They ended up going to the United States under disguise of being owned by Ford, but licensed,
So when we have to think about that. The United States won't just be nice to us because it might be that in this whole deleveraging and de-risking, whatever, the friendshoring, that they might end up winning from this.
Would you agree that in areas where the Chinese are actually clear leaders, we should be perhaps less gun shy in terms of working with them?
Yeah, but it might just be not something we can avoid. Because if the rest of the world is using, if we have more, for example, I don't think we're going to go back to where we were like 15 years ago in terms of our trade relationship. But I think that if we do more trade with them, we actually have something to talk about. Whereas if we, if we do less, why would they?
Well, the irony is during the years of the two Michaels, when certainly the bilateral relationship was at a very, very low ebb, record trade numbers. So
Interesting.
So there you go. And on EVs, a little anecdote before we move to the questions, you might be interested. Maybe you know this, but you might not. Daniel here, one of my colleagues, took a deep dive into the state of China trade recently, and we realized that over the last year, there's been several $1 billion, I think $5 or $6 billion worth of Chinese EV exports to Canada. And
which brands?
It's all Tesla, right? And the reason for that is they can't get into the U.S. market because of the certain aspects of the, I think it's the IRA, but it may be some other legislative regime. So the U.S. fortress is closed, but ours is open to Teslas coming in from China. So actually most Teslas bought in Canada right now are actually made in China, which is not something that I do until we actually look.
So for all those that are concerned about this, I just want to put it, wouldn't it be better if some parts of that were made in Canada?
There you go. Okay, so from there, let's move, Daniel, to some questions.
So the first question we have is, could you speak on India's growing capacity and what that means for China and Asia more broadly, specifically given the demographic concerns in China?
India.
Yes.
Oh, so I'm not an India expert, but I'll say this. I mean, it's great that India is doing well. I mean, we're talking about this India displacing Chinese manufacturing. No, it's just taking those kind of lower tier jobs, and that's good. I just I don't think we should do it at China versus India because it's just a very different it's a very different story. Like it's going to be just physically, geographically, it's going to be hard for China to replace India because it's not there. Besides Japan, Korea, Taiwan is not there. Singapore is not there. Malaysia, Indonesia are not there. They're closer to India, but the supply chains developed and thrived for a reason. There is a big geographic component to it. In India, there is a distance. There's a physical distance. Now, does it mean that they can still do a lot more with manufacturing? Sure. And let's see what happens as their economy develops. I think that's great. That's another addition to the global growth story. And their demographics are certainly favorable for a manufacturing boom because there's a lot of young people, some of them without skills that need jobs and livelihoods, and that's great. And I don't think that affects things in a big way. I just think we have to think about these two economies very different contexts. Is that a satisfactory answer?
Yes.
Do you want to add to it?
No, I think we'll move to the next question.
So the next question is, it would be useful to hear your assessment of how impactful China's commitment is to counter-cyclical market disciplines, for example, competition policy, disciplines on demand aggregation platforms, and disciplines on capital flows.
There's a few questions in there, but so China, some of those are not really, I understand them as structural, like things like platforms and regulation, that's structural, whereas capital controls are counter-cyclical. But I want to add, I'm glad that this person mentioned counter-cyclicality, because that's one thing that China has not been willing to do, and that's apply very strong fiscal sort of stimulus. I just don't think they believe in it. We think that, we have a pandemic and they're like, all right, well, there's a huge drop in demand and we have to make up for that by giving people money, right? And they think that their biggest problem, whatever, I have my own views on that, but, that I don't think that's relevant. They have assessed their problem as a supply problem. They think that they have structural problems they overcome. If they just spend money, that money is going to be wasted. I mean, part of that is true. I mean, they're not as efficient as spending government money. Like if we think we have government waste, they could do a lot. There could be a lot worse ways in their context. And they just don't, they could get growth up a couple of % with fiscal stimulus, and a lot of Chinese economists have made that case. But I just don't think the government wants to. I think they want lower growth, and this is where high quality. They want lower high quality. Whatever we think of that, but that's what they're thinking.
Anything else or?
We have 2 more questions.
Okay, look, we're a bit over time, but we can take another 3 to 5 minutes and then wrap it
Do one more question maybe?
up. Okay, sure.
So if investment FDI inflow won't yield growth the same as before, and we cannot expect consumption to drive growth as you've indicated, then what should we expect as the main drivers for Chinese growth?
And this is where we get to question of productivity. I think that what's going to drive what
Which we took out of the presentation because it would have added another half hour, but it's still a very fascinating question.
So the thing is, there's a lot of areas of China that you can actually have a productivity boost by basic catching up. In a lot of third-tier cities, you can build not very heavy investment, very basic infrastructure. You know, what I think they're focusing now is adding sort of digital connectivity to parts that are not as well connected. They're focusing on like making factories, like robotics is huge. They want coming out of automation. You know, they have, if you look at the amount of robots they installed, you see, wow, it's like way ahead of everyone. But on a per capita basis, it's way lower than Korea and Japan. And that's what they want. They want to be like Korea and Japan and Germany. They want to install a lot of robots, and they know that's a big productivity boost and that's a growth boost. And by the way, for all its controversies, that's what Made in China 2025 was about. It was about automation. That this is what they want. They want to identify areas where there's huge productivity gains, because real estate certainly was one of them anymore. And I think they're going to have to think about services. Like, that's my critique, as they're, you know, there's sectors of the economy where they could do things more efficiently and that they can have a growth boost, but they're not thinking about it too much. But, you know, they're just going to be, I think that's where growth is going to come from. That's why all the money is going to the industrial sector now. It's just not going to be like before. Like, you're not going to get 8% growth before. I don't think you are. And I think they'll be fine at 4% or 5%, whatever. However, you know.
Is there anyone in the room that would like to ask a question before we wrap?
I love the car, but you focus mostly on EV, and you look at all the legislation, the anti-China takeover in the US. A lot of it's tied up with the IT sector, and recently biotech. And just what were the thoughts about those sectors?
Well, thank you. I actually, yeah, I wanted to talk about EVs because it's most visible, but biotech isn't. See, that's a real negative for everyone, because biotech is somewhere like, you know, biotech is actually a big part of China's innovation story. And if you think about, you know, for example, how we're, you know, in Silicon Valley right now, AI is really focused on business and consumer solutions, whereas in China, they're not that advanced in those sectors of AI, but biotech,
Yeah,
that's where they want to throw. Like, actually, if you want to talk about complementarity, why should they compete with us on ChatGPT? Like I said, they can't. They should do they should do biotech. Now, we have all this legislation against Chinese biotech, and that's actually a problem, because what if they come up with life-saving cancer drugs? What, are we just saying no to that? Like, I think that's just something we have to think about, because that, you know, I don't think biotech is a huge growth driver, but it's something they want to focus on, because, you know, when they look at the pharmaceutical market, Pfizer and whatever, they charge a lot of money for their drugs. If you can create cheaper Chinese, just like Canada, we have generics.
yeah.
If they can create cheaper drugs and keep healthcare costs down, then they can offer more healthcare to everyone. And they want to do that. But and also, why should we cut ourselves off from Chinese biotech? Like, I understand there's data issues, but that's something we should talk to them about. Like that's something, if they're reaching out, they're saying, hey, foreign executives, we're going to ease our data laws, and let's talk to them about it. This is one of these industries, like, okay, look, semiconductors, okay, that's done. Anything military drones, okay, that's done. But let's create a baseline, a bottom line, where there's things that we can talk about. I think biotech is.
So that's a great question, and I think it's a good way to end. You know, and maybe for everyone to reflect on what should really be the red lights, the yellow lights, and the green lights. I think we have a lot of homework to be done.
Yeah.
In the West, in terms of articulating the areas that we should be willing to engage in. And talks like today's, one of the purposes is to hopefully, you know, provide some additional information to help those reflections go forward. You know, on health, for example. I mean, I've had the chance to meet with folks, cutting edge AI pioneers in China, cutting edge digital health pioneers. The BGI folks have spent a lot of time. You know? And so, you know, you can see how actually, if you actually had a nexus where Western strengths on AI were better combined with Chinese strengths in terms of biotech and genetic engineering, et cetera, the outcomes could be accretive to the world, right? And so to have obstacles there, some of them might be justified, some of them less. So having some serious thinking about that. Okay, so Anton, thanks so much. You know, not only have you done a great presentation, but you've been very generous in subjecting yourself to a barrage of questions at the end and sharing your thoughts. So that's amazing, and I hope our audience enjoyed the talk. I think these questions are not just important for those of us who are China watchers per se, but what happens in China economically is going to impact on everything from global geopolitics to the price of Canadian commodity exports. And so there's a lot of people that have a lot of skin in this game. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining this talk. I wish everybody good luck.